Phase 3 of the 24-hour schedule runs from about 16 to 24 hours after waking. During that period of time, there are a few things that are going to support being in a state of mind, state of body, that are going to allow neuroplasticity to occur, that are going to allow the rewiring that you've triggered during the waking part of the day to actually take place. Those things are very low to no light, meaning keeping your environment very dark or very, very dim. I don't think it's necessary to sleep in a room that's complete blackness. I think that's a little bit overkill. But for most people, keeping the room dark and keeping the room temperature low is very beneficial for getting and staying in deep sleep. The body has to drop by about 1 to 3 degrees in order to get into sleep and to stay asleep. So low light, low temperature environment. You can always pile on blankets, of course, if you don't want to be cold at night. You want to be warm enough, but you want your environment to be cold. Typically, people aren't eating in the middle of the night, although one thing that can be useful is to make sure that you're at least well fed enough when you head into this third phase of every 24-hour day that you're not awake because you're hungry. Now, a lot of people recommend putting a gap between your final bite of food and when you go to sleep at night. Some people say that gap should be 4 hours. Other people say 2 hours. If you're me, I generally have something, within 2 hours or 90 minutes of going to sleep, but it's not a big meal. But that's just me, and I fall asleep and stay asleep fine with that. You have to experiment for yourself. I've talked about supplements that can support sleep in previous episodes of the podcast, things like magnesium threonate or magnesium bisglycinate, things like theanine, apigenin. If you'd like to read more about those, we actually have a newsletter that I'll just quickly refer you to. This is the Huberman Lab Neural Network newsletter. You can sign up for it by going to hubermanlab.com. It's very easy to find. But even if you don't sign up, you can go to the toolkit for sleep that's listed there. And that toolkit is not just supplements. That toolkit is a number of different things, both behavioral and supplement-based and nutrition-based, et cetera, that can allow you to get into sleep and to stay asleep more readily. It's totally zero cost. You can find that again at hubermanlab.com. So things like low light, low temperature, the supplements I mentioned, adjusting your eating schedule appropriately, obviously not drinking caffeine in the middle of the night or too close to bed. That's going to be critical. In fact, ideally, you wouldn't ingest any caffeine in phase 2 of the day so that you could get into this deeper state of rest in which habit formation and neuroplasticity can occur. What if you wake up? Right? The way I've cast phase 3 is that you're supposed to be in this deep slumber. You're not supposed to wake up at all. You're supposed to be in low light and your brain is rewiring and those habits are getting consolidated, etc. Well, if you're like me, you probably get up once in the middle of the night. Maybe you go use the restroom. Perfectly normal. But a lot of people have trouble falling back asleep. Very important if you get up in the middle of the night to use a minimum of light in order to navigate your surroundings, just as much as you need in order to safely do so. Because light inhibits the hormone melatonin, can make it very hard to fall back asleep if you inhibit melatonin. The effects of light inhibiting melatonin are actually very potent, happens very, very quickly. So try and keep the lights low. And if you have trouble falling back asleep, that's when you might also want to use something like the Reverie app. They have a sleep script there that can hopefully help you get back to sleep, or something like NSDR. You can find NSDR scripts on YouTube. These are zero cost. You can look up one that I particularly like is NSDR Made For. It's a company I'm associated with, but the NSDR is completely zero cost. And there are other things like Yoga Nidra, which you can find scripts for elsewhere. Again, all of these habits or these behaviors, these do's and don'ts around phase 3 themselves might be habits that you're trying to create for yourself. But again, phase 3 is really about making sure that whatever limbic friction you've been able to override in phase 1 and trigger some new habit, right? Forcing yourself to write or forcing yourself to study or forcing yourself to exercise during that high limbic friction state. And then whatever things you've been doing in phase 2, which are habits that hopefully have moved a little bit further along the continuum of newly formed versus all the way to reflexive, or things that take less limbic friction in order to do. Phase 3 is when all of that gets really locked into the nervous system through those Hebbian mechanisms like NMDA receptors, et cetera, that I talked about before. Again, neuroplasticity is the basis of habit formation, and neuroplasticity and the rewiring of neural circuits happens in these states of deep sleep. So if you're not obeying this phase 3, if you're not giving phase 3 the materials it needs, and you're not avoiding the certain things like caffeine and bright light and stress during phase 3, you're simply not going to be able to build those habits that you've been working so hard to trigger in phase 1 and phase 2 of the day. Again, these are things that I've talked about in previous episodes of the podcast and elsewhere. But really, this is about habit formation. And the whole reason for placing particular types of behaviors at particular phases of the day is to set a framework for that task bracketing. Again, task bracketing and those circuits of the basal ganglia indicate that it's not just the neural circuits that are engaged by the task itself, but the neural circuits that are engaged before and after that task execution. That's what gets consolidated. So when you do things at particular phases of the day, under particular conditions of neurochemistry, what you're doing is you're giving the brain a very predictable set of sequences that during sleep, it can start to put into your hard drive, if you will. It can really program it into your nervous system so that within a short period of time, hopefully within 18 or maybe even 6 days, or who knows, maybe even fewer days, you'll find that executing those behaviors is very, very straightforward for you, and that you won't have to feel so much limbic friction or override so much limbic friction.